My
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Hidden Compass, a reimagined YouTube series. I am your always host, Lauren Eckert, and I am really, really excited and humbled to be graced today by Dr. Sandhya Narayanan. Sandhya is an assistant professor at the University of Nevada, Reno in the Department of Anthropology. Sandhya is a linguistic anthropologist, and her work, I'll just be broad here, focuses on the ways that Indigenous and minoritized identities and subjectivities are managed through multilingual practices. I will ask you much more about that shortly. And Sandhya is also a National Geographic explorer, and that is where we were lucky to meet through society and through activities that followed. Sandhya, welcome.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm thrilled that you're here despite being a busy assistant professor at this time of year, as we recently discussed.
It's a busy time of year.
So before I launch into some questions that are constant throughout the Reimagined series, I would love to just hear a little bit, perhaps an elevator pitch about your work, introduce the audience to your study in linguistics and multilingual practices.
Yeah, so I think just going back to what is a linguistic anthropologist, because we do study language, but we don't study, and we do study language in terms of, structures and forms and grammar, but we try and understand these things within actually how it affects our everyday world, right? So how is it that the way that we use language, speak language, think about language, even have opinions about language or anything related to language actually connects with how we think about ourselves, how we think about our communities, what we think about our identities, what we think about social differences, what we think about our histories, who we think we are, and how we think about how we relate to each other more broadly. So as a linguistic anthropologist, that's kind of fun, because you're basically looking at the life that language has through us as human beings.
Amazing.
And seeing what we do with it, what we say about it, what we don't think we're doing with it, but we actually do, and how that's all really meaningful to our day-to-day lives. So for me, it's a really broad topic. There's so many different ways that one could go about analyzing it or understanding it. But for me, I became really interested in multilingualism, partially because of my own upbringing and my background. I grew up in a really multilingual home and household and very multilingual neighborhoods. And this idea of what does it mean to speak multiple languages and maintain that in spaces, not only in places where that is seen as normal, but often in places where that might be stigmatized, became really interesting to me. So that's why I study it. I study what multilingualism means, but in particular, what is its relationship, especially when it does come to be stigmatized or looked down upon, or can be seen as a threat or threatening, and why that might be the case, and what is changing when people say and think and do things like that. Yeah.
A beautiful introduction to your research. I love that you brought us in on the ground floor of linguistic anthropology, because it's so fascinating. Language is something we all live within, use as art and communication, all of these things. It impacts our day-to-day life so much, and I think most of us get away with rarely thinking about it. So what an incredible area to study, especially in the multilingual context. Tanya is interested in what we're discussing in the background. Amazing. So as we discussed before we started recording, in this series Reimagined, we're often interested in talking about sort of three overarching themes, and usually we focus in on one, but I feel like you grapple with all of them. So those themes are reconsidering the impact of commonly used words with really heavy histories, on imagining new worlds that arise at the interface of others, whether it's knowledge types or disciplines or languages. And the other theme is escaping individual comfort zones in the context of science or storytelling or whatever that may be. So yeah, you fall into all of these categories of things I want to ask you about. So we won't tackle everything, but I guess I want to start by asking you about, as a linguist in particular, there are so many words that transform throughout history. They seem in constant motion. And I've had a lot of conversations with folks on this series and also with National Geographic explorers about the word explore and exploration. What are your thoughts on the modern use of that word given its colonial baggages?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And this is something like, I think even like more in like linguistic anthropologists are like really coming to terms with a lot of these terms like this, because so much of it has been foundational to our fields. But then there's also the question of, well, who was it foundational for in terms of the fields, right? And how has that changed? And it's not that hard to figure out how that has changed, really. Like I look at my like intellectual forebears, and like, yep, very different, very different. Like we don't, yeah. But it's interesting that you asked that, because for me personally, a lot, to this day, I feel like I feel like this, and I think it still holds, right? There's so much about that word explorer that is tied to that history, and a very particular history of discovery. And it's great to discover something like Halley's Comet, structure of DNA, fine. Those are wonderful things, right? But then within my field, right, of linguistic, I discovered a new language. It's like, people have been speaking this for a long time, right? Who are you to discover a language, right? And why are you even calling it a language? Because the people that you're talking with might not even call it that, right? They might call it something else. They might have a different idea about what it is. So what do you mean by you're discovering a language? I discovered a culture. I discovered a people. Well, people have always been around since Homo sapiens came on the scene. That is when people have been around. So how does that work? So I think for me, I feel like I'm like shooting my foot here forever in terms of funding, but I've always felt
perhaps mutual.
forever. What did she say? What did she say? What on earth did she say here? I always felt like odd about being called an explorer when you out and loud. It's like, oh yeah, I am that, aren't I? I suppose. And it feels very at odds, and it feels very at odds, not only knowing what that history is, but knowing that I also come from a background and legacy of people who have been described as, I have discovered this in my own background. I have discovered X. I have postulated that this is what their language is like. I have discovered this people, like written about people in my own heritage, my own family, right? Essentially. So it's kind of weird to be on that other end, but knowing that you were actually that object of exploration at one point in history, and now you are the explorer doing it. So I have a very hard time, and I feel like it's still, the way that these ideas develop, right? And in my field, we talk a lot about like language ideologies and how these certain ideas come and get associated with words and with currents and movements, right? And one thing that field of study shows, right, is that even though we may wish to change the narrative, right, and change the rhetoric, it's a lot more difficult, because there are so many of, it's not just baggage, but it's more like Lego bricks, like interconnecting this word with these histories, these legacies, these images, these individuals, their little like speech blurbs that some people might use on the signature line of their like emails and things like that. It's a bunch of these things. And in order to address what that legacy is, you actually have to address it all at once, which is a really challenging thing to do, because people have a lot of investment in in either one specific aspect of it or the whole thing, right? Or they cannot that like sort of separate one aspect, like the individual, from the work that they did, or the legacy of the work that they did, or how that work might have been taken up independent of that individual, but it still is tied to that individual, right? There's a lot of feelings and emotions and like this emotional investment that goes
identity investment, totally.
And it becomes really hard to try and change a lot of these conversations around it, to point out it's not just a problematic baggage, it's like a problematic net, really. And if you cut one hole in that net, it actually doesn't undo that entire history. You still have that entire net, and not only do you have that entire net, you have a lot of individuals who are willing to patch up that thing up, right?
Perhaps violently.
They're right there. They're right there with like the sewing gun. We'll just patch it up right now. So that's like the honest moment, the honest.
That's what we're here for. Oh my God, yes.
On his corner.
No, and you echo what a lot of other folks, especially Indigenous scholars and language revitalizationists who have been on, have shared, which is like this idea of reclamation works in some context, but we can't mass apply it to words we want to move forward with when they're built into interlocking systems of oppression, violence, racism, all sorts of things. So it's beautifully put.
And again, like exploration, like you're putting, even just at its basic, right? You're putting talking about other people at the same level of like DNA, right? Or at the same level of like Halley's Comet, or at the same level of Pluto is not a planet, or Pluto is, God knows what Pluto is these days. I don't know. I'm an astronomer, so
is it even?
Like, sounds great. You tell me it's a planet today.
Does it exist?
Tell me it's not a planet tomorrow. Okay.
Yeah.
I work with language, so it's like sounds great. But you're putting it on the same level of this, and that's not. This is human life, human heritage, and all the things that come with being human, which is histories of oppression, inequality, discrimination, violence, these types of things that come with it, that you're sort of putting on the same level as like what Pluto is. You know, it when you think about it like that, it's like, oh, that's a little bit weird. It's like borderline absurd. So yeah, it's I think explore as a word, as that noun, I find still very loaded. I kind of have that like kind of reaction. Totally. But I do like the verb explore.
Interesting.
In the sense of it's that question, it's asking you to push your limits. And I like that, especially in my field, because I'm not telling you to go, or I don't see myself as going to like spaces that no one has been before. It's like, no, people are there. People are everywhere. Like we've all been here. And I work with people. So I didn't go to a place that no one's been there before. Where would I find the people?
Totally.
Right? But there is something about that word, the verb, not the noun explorer, but the verb explore, because it's an invitation to push limits and push boundaries on things. And I take that as an invitation to push limits and push boundaries, at least in the sense of what can we do better?
Yeah.
There are another
internal even exploration.
Internal, even how can we talk about things in different ways? How can we share things in different ways? How can we like story tell or tell other stories, or think about our place in the world, or think about language's place in the world and human history and the story of humanity in a different way, right? And that's more, and what I like about it then, right, at least from this perspective, is like to push limits, right? Then you have to figure out, what does it take to push that limit?
Yeah.
And at least in my field, or at least the way like I try to do it, and definitely within like anthropology, right, it requires others. It requires the help of others. So pushing then the limits of how do I rethink my relationships with others?
Yeah.
How can I push against those types of relationships as they might have been and think about them in other ways?
Absolutely.
And dynamic. So yeah, explore will always kind of, but I try and spin the verb explore in this alternative direction. And again, I feel like explore still has a lot of that baggage of explorer, still very much I driven. Like one does it.
Yeah.
One person does it in this like place with an image and a cliff. And
Totally.
you know, that there's that like picture moment of that. And you know, I feel like explore will always have that sort of baggage with it as well. But I'm at least I try to see it as there is something about that verb. It's an invitation to do things differently.
Yeah.
And try things in new ways and to think about alternative possibilities. And working with people, working on things with language in our world and around issues of like equity and social justice, right? You have to think about what alternative possibilities can look like.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. And you shared those sentiments so eloquently, Sandhya. Oh my gosh. You clearly think about this stuff a lot and are so articulate in discussing them, perhaps because you're a linguist and you spend a lot of time thinking about language, English and other. I think there is something really important in the difference between the verb and the noun, because the noun is so coupled with identity. Like if you identify as an explorer, what does that mean about your constant mindset and your individuality? Yeah, and of course, that doesn't mean the verb is without baggage, but there's a difference in the tension perhaps there. And yeah, I echo that thought. Thank you very much for that wonderful answer. So I'm cognizant of your time, and perhaps I have a million questions I could ask and a million more things I want to talk about. But perhaps what I'll ask next, and perhaps what we can end with, is, you know, given what you've experienced as a linguistic anthropologist and what you continue to experience, what you've learned, and thinking about how words have changed over time, how with words we build new stories about ourselves. What future do you dream of? Like, what future do you imagine in the constraints of potential realities?
Oh my. I mean, there's just, that's a really big question. I mean,
it can be one version of a future.
I
won't
mean,
tie you down.
I mean, there's so many I mean, tolerance for like different ways of speaking, of a space for different languages to or linguistic varieties or ways of speaking to be recognized, right? But I think actually at its most basic, and I will say this because, you know, I'm now a new professor, I'm tasked with teaching these things. I think that's more why I like think about this. It's like, I'm now in charge of giving lectures on this topic. And how do I want to give these lectures in a way that really has an impact on my students? And I think it's actually like, for me personally, it's actually really changing how we think about language and culture. One thing that I struggle, especially outside of my own like academic field, right? When I speak with others outside of my own academic field, is I also, when I say, oh, well, actually, this is how language works. This is the relationship between language and culture. But even I wouldn't say language and culture, really like language and society, language in a place, language and community, like, no, not culture. But I will say, like, I get pushback, and I get like the nice pushback of like, really, is that so? Yes, it is. It is so.
I'm the one to tell you.
A lot of people in my field will like also say these things, right? It's not just me. I'm not the crazy person. I'm the crazy brown woman. But you know, it's amazing how much outside of our field, whenever we talk about language's relationship, first, what is language? How do we think about language? But then language's relationship with just people and groups of people and people in particular spaces and places. It's still talked about in, again, a very like colonial, old way of they talk like this and this is their culture, right? And having and experiencing what that pushback is like is always very interesting. So telling. It's like another thing that goes in the back of my brain. I'm like, I do know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So I think I sort of, I would like to see discussions around this change. I would like to see it become more prominent. I would like to see how we talk about it change and in a very like intentional way. And I say this, like, I don't think it's impossible. I mean, one thing that anthropology, for better or for worse, came up with was the concept of culture back during, the heyday of the early 20th century. And that was huge. That was huge to say at that time. Now, at that time, when culture as a concept was first presented, it was a big deal because it, for the first time, made an attempt to say, like, no, that this like primitive thing is not existent, right? You cannot say things like that. Now, that didn't last very long, kind of backtracked on itself. It didn't, but
not linear progression.
Not linear progression. And again, like when you try to like change the conversation around things, it's not a linear thing. It can make huge advances. Like people will say, oh, it's because of like cultural differences, and sure, right? But then there's like another problem that comes with a lot of other problems that come with saying things like that, like a whole bunch of
like the net, yeah.
A whole bunch of other problems that come with saying things like that as well. But again, something was introduced that did produce some change. Sure. A whole lot. And kind of also, fizzled in its own way as well. But it did do something, and I think it is possible. And what I would really like to see is having it more as a sustained conversation. What often happens is that outside of our fields, right? These things, in any field of science or social science or as humanities, they may enter beyond our disciplines into just dinner table conversations, right? For like a brief moment. And then no one talks about it for a while, right? And there's so much work that happens. So I feel like one thing that I would really like to see, especially around like language's relationship with people, right, is to actually not only change what those discussions and the ways that we talk about it look like, right, to not repeat these sort of colonial, very Western, capitalist, imperialist sort of positions, right, on it, but also to sustain it. In a way where it feels whatever the changes are, because there will be changes, it's going to change with each generation of academics in this, but like it also that change needs to be felt within broader discussion topic. And this, I don't think this is an issue just for me. Like I just say language, right? But I feel like climate scientists are like, they suffer the most. Well, they don't suffer the most, but they're like more publicly. You could see them publicly. No one sees me suffering. No one has like bothered to like document my public suffering. Right, but like climate scientists, we all know their public suffering. We can like see them publicly suffering. So we need to have like more public suffering of scientists. Sessions across not climate scientists. You're great, but you need to share the space a little bit. We're all suffering. We're all collectively.
It's all important and it's all misunderstood and under discussed. I actually, that's poetic. That's brilliant. I keep saying that, but I love that answer. Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it immensely. where can folks who are watching go to learn more about your work? And is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap?
No, I was just wondering, did you want to ask anything else? I do still have some time.
It's okay. This has been amazing. We have gotten
Okay.
so much. We'll do another one because I feel like we need to do 3 separate ones on each topic that Reimagined considers. But we'll do that when you're on vacation or something.
Okay, that's
Yeah, no, this has been really amazing, and I'd love to share links if people want to learn more about your work or read. You're writing a book, apparently. You're gonna publish.
Oh yeah, like I mean, it's aspirational. No, I'm in the middle of it. I am in the middle of it.
Amazing.
It'll come out soon. I have my faculty webpage at University of Nevada, Reno in the anthropology department. I also have a Facebook page, which I've gone to COVID mode of not updating it as much as I can. I hope to go back to updating it more. I hope to share actually this interview on it as well.
Amazing.
So, for followers who follow your web series, I will definitely post it on my Facebook page as well, which has more information about my ongoing activities as well. Cool. And yeah, I'm just beginning, so I'm excited to see where I end up as well. Who knows?
We'll hyperlink all of that in the show notes so folks can find you, and we'll definitely have you back. And thank you so much. You do so many amazing things, and it matters a lot, even if you're not suffering publicly.
I am suffering, just no one. Just like if poor Sandhya, brown woman Sandhya, is suffering in an office by herself, is she really? And no one's there to see it. She's still suffering.
Oh gosh, that's like a poem for all scientists.
Yeah.
Oh, especially in social science spaces, I feel like. But
I think it's a perpetual problem across a lot of academic disciplines, science, social sciences, humanities. We are all suffering.
Yeah. It's like screaming for folks to hear us. So please share this with people so they can learn more about Sandhya's work and watch her suffer in public. But she has really, really, really cool storytelling work she's done through National Geographic too. So we always appreciate that, and we'll hyperlink to all that stuff and follow along. And we'll see everybody next time. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us, Sandhya.